Hello again, sleepy traveler. You've returned to the land of questionable hygiene and even more questionable fashion choices. Tonight, we begin our journey with a look so coveted in medieval Europe, it could only be described as recently deceased chic. Yes, we're talking about the pale, ghostly complexion that dominated beauty ideals for centuries. If you looked like you'd just fainted in a cathedral, you were halfway too hot. The paler, the better. In medieval times, pale skin wasn't just a preference, it was a power move. It meant you didn't work outside, didn't toil in the fields, and probably hadn't seen the sun since last Lent. Nobility flaunted their pallor like a badge of honor. The goal? To look like you'd been raised in a crypt by candlelight. And if you weren't naturally pale, no problem. There were solutions. Terrible, terrifying solutions. DIY, deathly glow. Let's talk ingredients. Lead-based powders were all the rage. Yes, lead. The same stuff that now comes with a skull and crossbones warning. Mercury made guest appearances in face creams. Vinegar-soaked cloths were used to bleach the skin, and for the truly committed, bloodletting. Because nothing says radiant like draining your vitality. The result? A complexion so pale, it bordered on translucent and occasionally fatal. The sickly, sexy look, here's the twist. Looking ill was in tuberculosis, known then as consumption, gave people a thin frame, flushed cheeks, and a dreamy, faraway gaze. It was tragic, it was romantic, it was inexplicably fashionable. Poets wrote sonnets about women who coughed delicately into lace handkerchiefs. Artists painted noble ladies with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. If you looked like you were one heartbreak away from the grave, you were basically a medieval supermodel. Sleepy reflection. So as you lie in bed tonight, wrapped in your blanket and blessedly free of lead-based cosmetics, take a moment to appreciate your modern skincare routine. No vinegar cloths, no mercury, no bloodletting, just you, your moisturizer, and the knowledge that beauty no longer requires looking like a ghost with a tax bracket. Now, close your eyes. Let the candlelight flicker in your imagination, and drift off knowing that in another time, your natural glow would have been considered scandalously outdoorsy. To achieve the coveted pale complexion of medieval nobility, people turned to a cocktail of substances that would make a modern dermatologist weep. Chalk, vinegar, and alum were common ingredients, mixed into pastes and slathered across faces with the hope of achieving a ghostly glow. Egg whites were used to tighten the skin, leaving wearers shiny and stiff like freshly glazed pastries. But the real star of the show was lead. Lead-based powders were the medieval equivalent of foundation. They smoothed the skin, masked blemishes, and gave that prized pallor while slowly poisoning the user. Symptoms of lead toxicity included hair loss, muscle weakness, and a complexion that eventually turned gray. But in a society where looking sickly was sexy, gray was just another shade of glamour. The irony was thick. In trying to look healthy and noble, people were actively making themselves ill. And if their skin began to peel or blister, that was chalked up to bad humors, not the fact that they were rubbing powdered metal into their pores. Even worse, some treatments caused symptoms that mimicked leprosy, a disease feared and misunderstood in medieval Europe. Skin lesions, numbness, and discoloration were common side effects of toxic cosmetics. Yet rather than abandon their routines, many doubled down, convinced that beauty required sacrifice. And if that sacrifice involved looking vaguely diseased, so be it. In the end, the pursuit of pale skin was less about health and more about hierarchy. The whiter your face, the clearer your status. You didn't work, didn't sweat, and certainly didn't toil in the sun. You were elite, even if your skincare routine was slowly turning you into a cautionary tale. In the medieval beauty hierarchy, the forehead reigned supreme. A high, smooth, and impossibly vast forehead was the ultimate sign of elegance. The goal was to look like your face had been stretched vertically by divine hands. The more forehead, the more fabulous. To achieve this lofty look, women plucked their hairlines into oblivion. Tweezers, thread, and even hot wax were used to remove every trace of hair from the top of the forehead, sometimes reaching back as far as the crown. The result, a gleaming expanse of skin that gave the impression of constant surprise. This wasn't just a passing fad. It was a full-blown obsession. Portraits from the time show noble women with foreheads so large they could double as projection screens. Poets praised the heavenly dome of a lady's brow, and fashion manuals offered tips on how to maximize your cranial acreage. Eyebrows, too, were sacrificed in the name of forehead supremacy. Many women shaved them off entirely or plucked them into thin, barely their arches. Some drew them back on with charcoal or soot, often in shapes that defied both anatomy and good judgment. The pain was real. Plucking hairline and brows wasn't just tedious, it was excruciating. But beauty demanded it. A high forehead suggested intelligence, purity, and noble birth. It was the medieval version of contouring, except with more tweezers and less mercy. And if you were naturally blessed with a low hairline, tough luck. You either plucked your way to perfection or risked being mistaken for a peasant. In the medieval mind, a crowded forehead was a crowded soul. In the grand theater of medieval beauty, eyebrows were the understudies, present but rarely celebrated. In fact, the ideal brow was often no brow at all. The less hair above your eyes, the more refined you appeared. It was a look that said, "I'm so noble, even my face is minimalist." Women plucked their eyebrows into oblivion, sometimes removing them entirely. The goal was to create a smooth, uninterrupted canvas from forehead to eyelid, a blank space that screamed sophistication. If any hairs dared to grow back, they were swiftly evicted with tweezers, thread, or wax. But the story doesn't end with bald brows. Oh no. Many women took it a step further by drawing their eyebrows back on, not where they originally were, but higher, thinner, and often at angles that defied geometry. Charcoal, soot, and even crushed berries were used to sketch delicate arches that floated somewhere near the temples. The result, a look that was equal parts ethereal and unsettling. Think surprised ghost meets medieval mime. These drawn-in brows were meant to convey elegance, but often ended up looking like punctuation marks in search of a sentence. Men weren't entirely off the hook either. While they didn't pluck with the same fervor, bushy brows were frowned upon. A tidy, subdued brow was preferred, something that wouldn't distract from the forehead's glory or the beard's majesty. In a world obsessed with symmetry and symbolism, eyebrows were seen as wild, unruly, and vaguely suspicious. Better to erase them and start fresh. After all, nothing says I am above manual labor like a face that's been edited with medieval precision. If you've ever dabbed a bit of blush on your cheeks and thought, this could use more rodent, then congratulations. You're spiritually aligned with medieval beauty standards. Because, in the quest for rosy cheeks, some folks turn to one of the strangest cosmetic ingredients in history, boiled mouse. Yes, actual mice, boiled, mashed, applied. The logic, if we dare call it that, was simple. Crushed mouse flesh, when simmered and strained, produced a reddish tint that could be dabbed onto the cheeks for a healthy glow. It was believed to stimulate circulation, add color, and possibly ward off evil spirits, or acne, or boredom. The records are unclear. This wasn't the only bizarre blush option. Other recipes included crushed beetles for a deep crimson hue, red ochre mixed with animal fat for a creamy, earthy smear, wine-soaked wool dabbed gently on the cheeks like a medieval beauty blender. But boiled mouse had a certain prestige. It was rare, it was pungent, and it was undeniably memorable. Some apothecaries even sold it as a luxury item, packaged in tiny pots and marketed to noblewomen who wanted their cheeks to scream, "I own land, and I smell faintly of rodent." Of course, the scent was an issue. Mouse-based cosmetics didn't exactly smell like roses. To mask the odor, users layered on perfumes, rosewater, lavender oil, or, in desperate cases, frankincense. The result was a bouquet of aromas that could stun a bishop. And let's not forget the symbolism. Rosy cheeks were associated with youth, fertility, and vitality. A pale face with a hint of blush suggested you were delicate, desirable, and not currently dying of plague. It was the medieval version of no makeup, except with more vermin. In the end, the blush of boiled mouse was less about beauty and more about bravado. It said, "I'm committed, I'm bold, I'm willing to smear rodent on my face for the sake of fashion." And really, isn't that what beauty is all about? In medieval Europe, golden hair wasn't just admired, it was practically worshipped. Fair, sun-kissed locks were the ultimate symbol of purity, nobility, and divine favor. If your hair shimmered like a wheat field at dawn, you were halfway to sainthood. If it didn't, well, there were ways to cheat. Enter goosefat. To lighten their hair, medieval women concocted DIY dyes that would make a modern stylist run for the hills. One popular recipe involved mixing saffron, alum, and goosefat into a thick paste, which was then slathered onto the scalp and left to bake under the sun. The fat acted as a carrier, the saffron added color, and the smell lingered. Other methods included soaking hair in lye, which was as gentle as it sounds, rinsing with vinegar and chamomile for a subtler, less caustic glow, dusting with flour or crushed eggshells to fake a lighter shade temporarily. The goal was always the same, to achieve that angelic blonde hue that screamed, "I dan tea-milk cows." Blonde hair was associated with youth, virtue, and aristocracy, even if it came at the cost of scalp irritation and a faint poultry aroma. But it wasn't just about color. Texture mattered too. Smooth, flowing locks were ideal, and women went to great lengths to tame frizz and flyaways. Goosefat doubled as a conditioner, though it often attracted insects. Some used rose oil or honey, which added shine but also turned their heads into bee magnets. Hair was also a moral battleground. Loose hair signaled virginity or spiritual purity, while covered hair suggested modesty and marital status. A woman's hairstyle could communicate everything from her social rank to her availability, like a medieval Tinder profile, but with more veils. And for those who couldn't grow long, golden hair, wigs and extensions were available, made from human hair, horsehair, or, in rare cases, silk. These were expensive, itchy, and occasionally home to lice. But beauty, as always, demanded sacrifice. In the end, medieval hair care was a blend of ambition, alchemy, and animal byproducts. And if your scalp survived the process, congratulations, you were officially radiant. Not everyone in medieval Europe was blessed with flowing, golden locks. For those whose hair was thinning, graying, or simply not up to snuff, there was a solution: wigs, weaves, and a whole lot of medieval ingenuity. Wigs weren't just for disguise or drama, they were high fashion, crafted from human hair, horsehair, or even silk threads. These hairpieces were curled, braided, and styled to mimic the luscious manes of the elite. The richer you were, the more elaborate your wig. Some were so tall and ornate they required structural support, like scaffolding for your scalp. But wigs came with problems. They were heavy, itchy, and prone to attracting lice. Maintenance was a nightmare. They had to be powdered, perfumed, and occasionally boiled to kill off unwanted guests. And if you wore one in summer, prepare to sweat like a knight in full armor. Weaves and extensions were also popular, especially among women who wanted to enhance their natural hair. Strands were sewn, braided, or glued in using sticky substances like tree resin or animal fat. The result was often impressive until it started melting in the sun or sliding off during a dance. Hair theft was a real issue. Some wig makers resorted to cutting hair from sleeping peasants or collecting strands from combs and brushes left in public bathhouses. There were even rumors of grave robbing, with corpses being relieved of their locks for the sake of fashion. Nothing says luxury like posthumous highlights. Men weren't immune to the wig craze. Baldness was considered a sign of aging or illness. So many noblemen wore discreet toupees or full wigs to maintain their youthful image. These were often styled to match the latest trends: curls for court, waves for war, and straight hair for sermons. Despite the discomfort and occasional horror, wigs remained a staple of medieval beauty. They allowed people to reinvent themselves, to project status, and to hide the ravages of time and poor nutrition. And if your wig slipped mid-feast, just pretend it was a hat. Nobility was all about confidence. In medieval Europe, hair wasn't just a style, it was a statement. And nothing made a louder statement than virgin hair. Untouched, uncut, and unstyled. It was the holy grail of purity and virtue. If your locks flowed freely and hadn't been trimmed since birth, you were basically a walking halo. Virgin hair was associated with innocence, spiritual devotion, and moral superiority. Young maidens wore their hair long and loose, often down to the waist or beyond. It was meant to symbolize their unspoiled nature, a visual cue that they were unmarried, unblemished, and ready to be judged by a suitor or a saint. But maintaining virgin hair wasn't easy. Without modern shampoos or conditioners, long hair was a magnet for dirt, oil, and the occasional rodent. Combing was a daily ritual, often done with bone or wooden combs that doubled as lice scrapers. And yes, lice were a constant companion, the unofficial mascot of medieval grooming. Washing was rare. When it did happen, it involved herbal rinses made from rosemary, nettle, or vinegar. These helped with shine, smell, and scalp health, though they also left you smelling like a salad. Drying took hours, and styling was minimal. Braids were common, but anything too elaborate risked looking worldly or vain. Cutting hair was a serious decision. For women, it often marked a major life change: marriage, widowhood, or entry into a convent. Nuns shaved their heads as a symbol of renouncing vanity, while widows sometimes cropped their hair to signal mourning. A haircut wasn't just cosmetic, it was spiritual. Men had their own version of the virgin hair myth. Young squires and scholars often wore their hair longer, signaling youth and potential. As they aged or entered military service, shorter styles became the norm. Practical, masculine, and less likely to get caught in a helmet. Despite the challenges, virgin hair remained a powerful symbol. It was admired, envied, and occasionally fetishized in art and literature. Poets wrote verses about golden tresses untouched by scissors, and painters immortalized flowing locks as divine attributes. Of course, behind the myth was a lot of maintenance. Virgin hair might have been pure, but it was also tangled, itchy, and occasionally home to things that moved. Still, in the medieval mind, it was worth it, because nothing said morally superior like hair that hadn't met a blade. If medieval beauty had a crown jewel, it was the headgear, towering, elaborate, and often completely impractical. These weren't just hats, they were architectural statements, and they made the already exaggerated beauty standards of the time even more vertical. Let's start with the hennin, the iconic con-shaped headdress worn by noblewomen in the 15th century. These gravity-defying towers could reach up to 2 feet tall and were often draped with flowing veils that fluttered dramatically in the breeze. The hennin said, "I am rich, elegant, and possibly aerodynamic." But wearing one wasn't easy. They had to be balanced carefully, secured with pins, and avoided in windy weather, unless you wanted to take flight. Sitting down was a challenge. Doorways were a hazard, and dancing, only if you had excellent neck strength and a low ceiling clearance. Other popular styles included wimples, which wrapped around the neck and chin like a medieval neck brace. Coifs, tight-fitting caps that looked like baby bonnets, but were worn by grown adults. Crespins, netted hair coverings, often made of gold thread, perfect for showing off your lice-free locks. Each piece of headgear had a social meaning. Married women covered their hair completely, while unmarried girls could show a bit of braid or curl. The more fabric and decoration, the higher your status. Pearls, embroidery, and even jewels were sewn into the headpieces, turning heads into treasure chests. Men had their own headgear hysteria. From feathered caps to fur-lined hats, they flaunted their wealth and rank with every brim and buckle. Some styles were so wide they resembled satellite dishes, while others were so tight they looked like they'd been painted on. Headgear also served a practical purpose, sort of. It protected hair from dust, signaled marital status, and occasionally kept lice from spreading, though not very effectively. But mostly, it was about fashion. The bigger, the better. The more uncomfortable, the more impressive. In the end, medieval headgear was a balancing act, literally and socially. It required patience, posture, and a willingness to look mildly ridiculous in the name of beauty. And if your hennin toppled mid-feast, just pretend it was a dramatic flourish. Nobility was all about the performance. If you thought medieval beauty was all about towering headgear and pale foreheads, think again. The grooming rituals of the time were a mix of superstition, style, and sheer stubbornness, with a dash of animal fat for good measure. Let's start with the beard, the medieval man's pride and joy. A well-kept beard signaled wisdom, virility, and social standing. Kings had regal beards, knights had rugged ones, monks smooth as a sermon. Beard styles ranged from forked and braided to bushy and biblical. Some men even perfumed their beards with rosewater or musk, because nothing says chivalry like smelling like a garden. But grooming wasn't just for the gents. Women had their own rituals, many of which involved plucking. Eyebrows were thinned or removed entirely to emphasize the forehead, the higher, the holier. Hairlines were pushed back with tweezers to create the illusion of a larger dome. Painful, yes. Fashionable, absolutely. Hair itself was a canvas. Braids were popular, often woven with ribbons, beads, or even bits of metal. Noble women might spend hours having their hair styled into elaborate patterns, only to cover it with a wimple or veil. The irony was not lost on them, but beauty required sacrifice, and possibly neck strain. Then there were the bizarre grooming aids, lead-based face powders to achieve that ghostly pallor and a side of poisoning. Animal fat and ashes used as hair treatments or skin softeners. Urine, yes, human urine, sometimes used to bleach hair or treat skin conditions. Medieval dermatology was not for the faint of nose. Bathing was sporadic at best. Public bathhouses existed, but they were often frowned upon by the church, who saw them as dens of sin and nudity. Instead, people relied on dry washing, rubbing the skin with cloth, scented oils, or in desperate cases, bread. Yes, bread. A stale loaf could exfoliate and feed you efficiency. Despite the oddities, grooming was deeply tied to identity. A knight's beard, a lady's braid, a merchant's perfumed tunic. These were signals to the world. And while the methods may seem medieval literally, the desire to look good, smell decent, and impress your peers, timeless. Romance in the Middle Ages wasn't all chivalrous knights and swooning maidens. It was also awkward glances, questionable potions, and enough superstition to make Cupid run for cover. If modern dating is a minefield, medieval dating was a full-blown jousting tournament with herbs. Let's begin with the love potion, the medieval answer to Tinder. These concoctions promised to spark desire, bind hearts, and occasionally cause mild hallucinations. Recipes varied wildly, but common ingredients included mandrake root, believed to scream when pulled from the ground, romantic; rose petals, for beauty and sweetness; bat wings, for mystery and possibly flight; honey, to sweeten the target's disposition, and in some cases, bodily fluids. We won't elaborate. Let's just say medieval romance had no boundaries. These potions were brewed by herbalists, wise women, or that one aunt who claimed she could make anyone fall in love with a spoonful of goat's milk and a chant. Did they work? Debatable. But they were popular enough to be banned by the church, which saw them as meddling with divine matchmaking. Then came the courtship rituals, which were equal parts poetry and pestering. A nobleman might send a lady a poem, a song, or a falcon, yes, a live falcon, to express his affection. If she accepted, she might send back a token, a ribbon, a glove, or a lock of hair. If she declined, she might send back nothing. Or a sarcastic verse implying he smelled like turnips. For the lower classes, romance was more practical. Marriages were often arranged, and love came later, if at all. A good match meant shared goats, fertile land, and a mutual tolerance for lice. Still, there were moments of sweetness, dances at festivals, stolen kisses behind haystacks, and whispered promises under moonlight, usually followed by a hasty wedding if things got too romantic. Of course, not all love stories ended well. There were jealous rivals, forbidden affairs, and tragic misunderstandings. One knight might duel another over a lady's favor, only to discover she preferred the stable boy. A potion might backfire, causing hiccups instead of passion. And sometimes a serenade beneath a window ended with a bucket of chamber pot water. Love hurts, but through it all, medieval folks kept trying. They wrote love letters, carved initials into trees, and believed deeply in the magic of connection, even if that magic involved mandrake and mild poisoning. If you've ever complained about running out of shampoo, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors who considered a yearly bath ambitious and soap a luxury. Hygiene in the Middle Ages was less self-care and more self-survival. Let's start with the basics. Bathing. Public bathhouses did exist, especially in cities, and they were surprisingly popular until the church decided that nudity and cleanliness were suspiciously sinful. After that, bathing became a private, infrequent affair. A noble might bathe once a month or before a feast, while peasants relied on rivers, rain, or a good rub down with a damp cloth and a prayer. Soap, rare and expensive. Most people used lye-based mixtures, which could clean your skin and strip paint off a wall. Others used herbs, ashes, or animal fat, which left you smelling like a forest fire wrapped in bacon. Hair care was equally inventive. Rosemary and nettle rinses for shine, egg yolk masks for strength, and omelet-scented scalps. Urine, again, for bleaching and lice control. Yes, it's back. And yes, it was disturbingly common. Speaking of lice, they were practically medieval pets. Everyone had them. Noble women wore gold-threaded hairnets, not just for style, but to keep the lice from escaping mid-banquet. Combs were used daily, not to style, but to scrape. And if you were lucky, your lice had names. Dental hygiene, a mixed bag. Toothbrushes didn't exist, but people chewed on twigs, rinsed with vinegar, and used charcoal to scrub their teeth. Some even rubbed their gums with sage or salt. It wasn't perfect, but it beat the alternative, tooth rot and medieval dentistry, which involved pliers and prayer. Clothing hygiene was slightly better. Linen undergarments were changed more often than outerwear, and people believed that clean linen drew out impurities. So instead of washing your body, you just changed your shirt and hoped for the best. It was the medieval version of new socks, new you. Despite all this, medieval folks weren't oblivious. They valued cleanliness. They just had different standards. A fragrant pouch of herbs around the neck, a spritz of rosewater, and a strategically placed veil could mask a multitude of sins. And if all else failed, they blamed bad smells on demons. In the end, hygiene was a balancing act between superstition, scarcity, and sheer determination. And while it may seem horrifying by modern standards, it was their version of self-care, minus the bubble bath and scented candles. If medieval fashion had a motto, it was, the more absurd, the more admired. The feudal elite didn't just dress to impress. They dressed to confuse, intimidate, and occasionally trip over their own sleeves. Welcome to the runway of ridiculous. Let's begin with the houppelande, a robe so voluminous it could double as a tent. Worn by both men and women, it featured sleeves that dragged on the ground like fabric serpents' collars so high they grazed the ears, girdles, belts, cinched tightly to emphasize the waist, even if the waist was buried under 10 layers of wool. The houppelande said, "I am wealthy, important, and possibly hiding a small dog in my sleeve." Then there were the pointy shoes, known as poulaines. These footwear marvels had toes so long they had to be tied to the knees with chains to prevent tripping. The longer the toe, the higher your status. Some nobles had shoes with tips over 2 feet long. Walking was a challenge. Running was impossible. But standing still, majestic. Color was another status symbol. Bright dyes were expensive. So nobles flaunted crimson, violet, and deep blue like peacocks at a pigment party. Patterns were bold, often featuring stripes, checks, or embroidered scenes of hunting, jousting, or biblical drama. If your outfit didn't tell a story, were you even trying? Accessories were equally outrageous. Cod pieces for men, padded, prominent, and proudly displayed because subtlety was for peasants. Horned headdresses for women, resembling antlers, towers, or satellite dishes, bejeweled belts, gold-threaded gloves, and fur-lined everything, even in summer. But with great fashion came great folly. Some garments were so heavy they required assistance to put on. Others were so tight they restricted breathing. And let's not forget the sumptuary laws, rules that dictated who could wear what, lest a merchant accidentally dress like a duke and cause a social meltdown. Violating these laws was a fashion crime. Wearing silk without noble blood, fined. Sporting ermine without royal ties, scandalous. Dressing above your station could lead to public shaming, confiscation of garments, or being forced to wear something appropriately drab. The medieval version of being Still, the elite pushed boundaries. They layered, laced, and strutted through castles like walking tapestries. Their fashion was a declaration: I am rich, powerful, and willing to suffer for style. And suffer they did, in heat, in discomfort, and occasionally in ridicule. But they looked fabulous doing it. If medieval makeup had a tagline, it would be, "Beauty is pain, and possibly poisoning." The quest for the perfect complexion led nobles down a rabbit hole of rouge, recipes, and regrettable decisions involving lead, lard, and crushed beetles. Let's start with the ideal look: pale skin, rosy cheeks, and a forehead so high it could host a chess tournament. This wasn't just fashion, it was status. Pale skin meant you didn't toil in the sun like a commoner. Rosy cheeks meant you were alive and possibly flirtatious. And a towering forehead. That was peak aristocratic allure. To achieve this, medieval makeup artists, often the women themselves, turned to their kitchens, gardens, and occasionally their livestock. Popular ingredients included lead-based powders to whiten the skin, yes, the same lead that causes neurological damage, mercury for a luminous glow, and a side of madness. Crushed berries or beetles for rouge, vibrant, natural, and slightly crunchy egg whites applied to the face for a tight, shiny finish like medieval Botox. Eyebrows were often plucked into oblivion, then redrawn with charcoal or soot. Lips were tinted with cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound that gave a rich red hue and a mild sense of doom. And for those who wanted to go the extra mile, mouse fur was sometimes glued to the eyelids as makeshift lashes. Yes, mouse fur, because nothing says glamour like rodent fringe. But makeup wasn't just about enhancement. It was also about deception. Women used cosmetics to appear younger, healthier, and more fertile. Men, too, dabbled in powders and pomades, especially at court, where looking polished was part of the political game. Of course, there were risks. Prolonged use of lead and mercury led to skin damage, hair loss, and in some cases, death. But beauty was worth it, or so the fashion scrolls claimed. And if your face started peeling mid-feast, just dab on more rouge and pretend it's a new trend. Makeup also had moral baggage. The church often frowned upon cosmetics, seeing them as vanity or witchcraft. Women who wore too much were accused of seduction, deception, or worse, trying to look like they weren't suffering from plague. Scandalous. Still, the allure of transformation was irresistible. A little powder, a touch of rouge, and suddenly you were the belle of the banquet, even if your cheeks were burning and your eyebrows were missing. In the end, medieval makeup was a cocktail of creativity, chemistry, and chaos. It was art, it was danger, it was mouse fur on your face. For all their elegance and extravagance, medieval outfits were one gust of wind away from disaster. Welcome to the Hall of Fame, a tribute to the slips, snags, and sartorial catastrophes that made history, or at least dinner parties, unforgettable. Let's start with the hoopyland, that majestic robe with sleeves longer than a moral sermon. One noblewoman famously tripped on hers while descending a staircase, tumbling into a bishop and knocking over a roast swan. The bishop forgave her, the swan did not. Then there were the poulains. One courtier, trying to impress a duchess with his dance moves, got his poulains tangled mid-spin and face-planted into a lute player. The lute survived. His dignity did not. Codpieces, those padded, prominent fashion statements, were ripe for embarrassment. A young squire once stuffed his with extra fabric to appear more ... formidable. Unfortunately, it slipped mid-feast, launching a piece of roast quail across the table and into the queen's goblet. He was promptly reassigned to stable duty. Ladies weren't spared either. The hennin, that towering, con-shaped headdress, was a magnet for mishaps. One noblewoman leaned too close to a candle and set her veil ablaze. Luckily, her companion doused it with wine. Unluckily, it was the king's best vintage. Sumptuary law violations also led to wardrobe drama. A wealthy merchant tried to sneak into a noble ball wearing forbidden velvet. He was caught, stripped of his finery, and forced to wear a burlap tunic labeled pretender. He later started a fashion trend called peasant chic. Even armor had its moments. One knight, eager to impress, wore a custom suit with gilded joints. It looked stunning until he tried to kneel and got stuck mid. He remained in that position for 3 hours while squires tried to pry him loose with butter and Latin prayers. And let's not forget the wind, the eternal enemy of medieval modesty. Cloaks flew, veils lifted, and tunics betrayed their wearers. One gust during a royal parade revealed a duke's undergarments, which to everyone's surprise featured embroidered ducks. He claimed it was a family crest. No one believed him. Despite the chaos, these wardrobe malfunctions were part of the charm. They reminded everyone, nobles, knights, and commoners alike, that beneath the velvet and fur, they were all human. Embarrassingly, gloriously human. Not all medieval beauty rituals were disasters wrapped in goose fat. Some were surprisingly clever, or at least less poisonous than usual. Tonight, we explore the hacks that didn't involve lead, rodents, or spiritual peril. Just a little creativity, a dash of desperation, and a whole lot of herbs. Let's begin with rosewater, the MVP of medieval skincare. Distilled from petals and used as a toner, perfume, and general mood enhancer, rosewater was gentle, fragrant, and actually effective. It soothed irritated skin, masked unpleasant odors, and gave the illusion of freshness, even if you hadn't bathed since Easter. Honey was another hero. Used as a face mask, it moisturized healed wounds and added a subtle glow. It also attracted bees, but that was considered a minor inconvenience. Some women mixed honey with crushed almonds for exfoliation, creating the medieval version of a spa scrub, minus the cucumber slices. Egg whites were applied to the face to tighten skin and reduce the appearance of wrinkles. The result? A shiny, slightly sticky complexion that screamed, "I'm youthful and breakfast ready." It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, temporarily. For hair, rosemary rinses were popular. Boiled in water and poured over the scalp, rosemary helped with shine, dandruff, and general scalp health. It also made your head smell like a roast chicken, which was either charming or confusing, depending on the occasion. Nettle tea was used to clear the skin from within. Rich in nutrients, it was believed to purify the blood and reduce blemishes. Did it work? Possibly. Did it taste like medieval punishment? Absolutely. Even charcoal had its moment. Ground into powder and used to clean teeth, it helped scrub away grime and left mouths looking slightly less medieval. It also turned your smile temporarily black, which was great for Halloween, less so for weddings. Some hacks were more psychological. Mirror gazing was considered therapeutic, a way to reflect on one's soul while checking for forehead symmetry. Cold water splashes were used to wake up the skin and the spirit, and herbal sachets tucked into clothing provided a constant whiff of lavender, mint, or not plague. Of course, not all hacks were winners. Some involved snail slime, pigeon droppings, or chanting while applying ointment. But the ones that worked, even a little, were treasured, passed down, and occasionally written into beauty manuals, with titles like The Virtuous Glow or How Not to Die Beautifully. In the end, medieval beauty was a blend of trial, error, and herbal optimism. And while some hacks were questionable, others were quietly brilliant. Proof that even in a world of powdered mice and mercury blush, a little rosewater could go a long way. Medieval dentistry was less say cheese and more say your prayers. Teeth were a battlefield, assaulted by mead, mystery meats, and a complete lack of floss. Yet somehow, people smiled, sometimes even proudly. Tonight, we explore the curious state of medieval mouths. Let's start with the basics. Toothbrushes didn't exist. Instead, people chewed on twigs, usually from aromatic trees, like neem or rosemary, which doubled as breath fresheners and primitive scrubbers. These chew sticks were surprisingly effective, assuming you didn't mind looking like a goat gnawing on a branch. Charcoal and salt were the go-to toothpaste substitutes. Mixed into a gritty paste, they helped remove plaque and occasionally enamel. The result? Cleaner teeth, but with the subtle flavor of campfire and regret. Mouthwash was a thing, sort of. People rinsed with vinegar, wine, or herbal infusions. Mint, sage, and myrrh were popular choices, though some recipes included urine. Yes, urine. It was believed to whiten teeth. It also guaranteed social distancing. Tooth decay was rampant, especially among the wealthy. Why? Sugar. Imported and expensive, sugar was a status symbol and a dental disaster. Nobles indulged in candied fruits, marzipan, and sweet wines, often ending up with blackened teeth and chronic pain. Ironically, peasants had better teeth thanks to their grain-heavy, sugar-free diets. When a tooth went rogue, there was only one solution: extraction. No anesthesia, no sterilization, just a strong hand, a pair of pliers or tongs, and a prayer to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. Some barbers doubled as dentists, offering haircuts and extractions in the same chair. It was a one-stop shop for pain and style. False teeth existed, but they were rare and terrifying. Made from animal bone, ivory, or even other people's teeth, they were wired into place and prone to falling out mid-feast. Smiling was a gamble. Kissing was an extreme sport. Despite all this, oral hygiene wasn't entirely ignored. People chewed cloves for fresh breath, avoided overly sticky foods, and believed in balancing humors to prevent tooth rot. Some even carried toothpick cases as fashion accessories, a sign of refinement and readiness. And then there were the superstitions. Toothaches were blamed on toothworms, tiny creatures believed to burrow inside molars and cause pain. Treatments included smoking them out with herbs or chanting spells to banish them. Spoiler, the worms didn't exist, but the pain definitely did. In the end, medieval smiles were a mix of luck, twigs, and sheer willpower. Some were dazzling, others were historically accurate, but every grin told a story of survival, status, and the eternal hope that maybe, just maybe, this next chew stick would do the trick. In a world where bathing was rare and sewage was everywhere, scent wasn't just a luxury, it was survival. Tonight, we sniff our way through the fragrant and occasionally foul world of medieval perfumes, potions, and olfactory illusions. Let's begin with the basics. Body odor was universal, but not always unwelcome. A bit of musk was considered earthy, even seductive, but too much. That was a sign of poor humoral balance, demonic possession, or simply being French, depending on who you asked. To combat the stench, people turned to perfumes and scented oils. These were made from flowers, herbs, spices, and animal ingredients, like ambergris, whale vomit, but fancy. Rose, lavender, and myrrh were popular among the wealthy, while peasants made do with mint, sage, or whatever grew near the latrine. Pomanders were the medieval version of portable air fresheners, small, perforated balls filled with aromatic herbs and resins. They were worn around the neck or carried in pockets. Some were so elaborate they doubled as jewelry, a statement piece that said, "I smell like cloves, and I'm not dying today." During plague outbreaks, scent took on a protective role. The belief was that bad smells caused disease, so good smells could prevent it. Physicians wore beaked masks stuffed with herbs, creating a barrier between their noses and the miasma. It didn't work, but it looked terrifying, like a bird auditioning for a horror film. Bathing rituals, when they happened, often included scented oils. Public bathhouses offered rosemary-infused steam, rosewater rinses, and post-bath perfumes. These were social hubs, places to gossip, relax, and temporarily smell like something other than despair. Even clothing was scented. Garments were stored with sachets of dried herbs, sewn with lavender sprigs, or sprinkled with rose petals. Some nobles had servants whose job was to perfume their robes before public appearances. It was the medieval version of dry cleaning, minus the dry or the cleaning. Hair perfumes were also a thing. Oils infused with jasmine or cinnamon were combed through locks to add shine and scent. Unfortunately, they also attracted insects. But hey, beauty has always had its price. And then there were the love potions. Fragrant brews meant to seduce, enchant, or mildly poison, made from exotic spices, rare flowers, and questionable intentions. They were dabbed behind ears, sprinkled on letters, or slipped into goblets. Did they work? Maybe. Did they smell amazing? Absolutely. In the end, medieval scent was more than vanity. It was identity, protection, and a form of silent communication. A whiff of rosemary said, "I'm clean." A cloud of myrrh said, "I'm rich." And a pomander the size of a melon said, "I'm terrified of dying, but I'll smell fabulous doing it." Medieval fashion wasn't just about flaunting wealth or hiding questionable hygiene. It was a full contact sport, one where beauty battled practicality and style occasionally knocked out common sense. Tonight, we slip into the dangerously divine world of garments that could maim, suffocate, or spontaneously combust. Let's start with the corset's chaotic cousin, the cot hardie. This tightly fitted garment hugged the torso like a clingy X, often laced so aggressively that breathing became optional. Women fainted regularly, not from swooning, but from a lack of oxygen. The upside, a snatched waist; the downside, rib bruises and a reputation for dramatic exits. Then came the pointy shoes of doom. These elongated footwear marvels had tips so long they had to be tied to the knees to prevent tripping. Nobles strutted around like fashion-forward flamingos, while peasants mocked them from the sidelines. Poulains were banned in some cities for being impractical and morally suspicious, which, to be fair, they were. Tall hats were another hazard. The hennin, a cone-shaped headpiece worn by noblewomen, reached heights of up to 3 feet. It was majestic, yes, but also a fire risk near candles and a wind trap on castle balconies. One gust and your dignity was airborne. Let's not forget the fur-lined everything. Fur was a status symbol, but it also attracted fleas, trapped heat, and occasionally burst into flames near open hearths. One bishop famously caught fire during a sermon, proving that divine inspiration and flammable robes don't mix. Heavy brocade gowns were stunning and suffocating. Worn in summer, they turned noblewomen into walking ovens. Layers of wool, velvet, and embroidery made movement difficult and fainting inevitable. Servants carried smelling salts, fans, and occasionally buckets of water. Fashion was pain, and hydration was for peasants. Men weren't spared. The doublet, a padded jacket worn under armor or over shirts, was stylish but stifling. Add a codpiece, the infamous flap that exaggerated masculinity, and you had a look that screamed, "I'm powerful," uncomfortable, and possibly compensating. Lead-based makeup made another appearance here. Pale skin was in, and lead was the shortcut. Applied daily, it caused skin damage, hair loss, and eventual death. But hey, you looked flawless in your funeral portrait. Even dyes were dangerous. Bright colors like green and red were achieved using arsenic, mercury, or other delightful toxins. Wearing them was a flex. Surviving them was a miracle. And then there were the sumptuary laws, rules that dictated who could wear what. Violating them could result in fines, imprisonment, or public shaming. So not only could fashion kill you, it could also get you arrested. Medieval style was high-stakes couture. In the end, medieval fashion was a balancing act between elegance and endurance. People suffered for style, strutted through discomfort, and occasionally combusted in the name of beauty. And while the looks were legendary, the risks were real, proving that in the Middle Ages, being on fire wasn't always a compliment. When the sun dipped behind the castle walls and the chamber pots were emptied hopefully, medieval folk turned their attention to sleep, a nightly voyage into mystery, superstition, and surprisingly elaborate bed setups. Tonight, we tiptoe into the world of medieval slumber, where dreams were divine, beds were status symbols, and nighttime was anything but boring. Let's start with the bed itself. For the wealthy, it was a fortress of fabric, carved wood, feather mattresses, embroidered canopies, and enough curtains to stage a small play. These weren't just for comfort, they were for warmth, privacy, and showing off. A noble's bed was often the most expensive item in the house, second only to their ego. Peasants, meanwhile, made do with straw-stuffed sacks or simple wooden frames. Blankets were rare, so they layered whatever they had, cloaks, animal skins, or each other. The goal wasn't luxury, it was survival, and maybe not waking up with a rat in your shoe. Nightwear varied wildly. Nobles wore linen shifts or silk robes. Peasants slept in their day clothes. Some people slept naked, believing it was healthier. Others wore hats to bed, fearing that cold air might sneak into their brains and cause melancholy. Medieval logic was nothing if not imaginative. Sleep itself was divided into two phases, first sleep and second sleep. People would doze off after sunset, wake around midnight, and then engage in quiet activities, praying, stoking the fire, whispering secrets, or sneaking off for a romantic rendezvous. Then they'd drift back into second sleep until dawn. It was a rhythm shaped by candlelight and quiet hours, not alarm clocks and caffeine. Dreams were serious business. They were messages from God, warnings from the beyond, or reflections of your humors. Dream manuals existed, offering interpretations, like if you dream of fish, expect betrayal, or if you dream of flying, your soul is trying to escape your body, comforting, to ward off nightmares. People placed protective charms near the bed, herbs like lavender or mugwort, religious relics, or even iron nails. Some believed that sleeping with your mouth open invited demons. Others believed that sleeping on your left side summoned visions. Either way, bedtime was a spiritual minefield. And then there were the nocturnal noises, creaking wood, howling wind, distant church bells, and the occasional scream from someone who forgot to latch the privy door. Sleep was never silent. It was a symphony of medieval life, raw, restless, and oddly poetic. But despite the discomfort, the superstition, and the occasional bedbug uprising, sleep was sacred. It was the one time of day when status faded, candles dimmed, and everyone, from kings to cobblers, closed their eyes and wandered into the same mysterious realm. And so we end our journey, powdered, perfumed, and tucked beneath a canopy of curiosity. The medieval world was messy, marvelous, and magnificently strange. But tonight, let it fade into dream. Let the corsets loosen, the chew sticks rest, and the pomanders swing gently by the bedside. Sleep well, dear dreamer. History will still be weird in the morning.